All right, everyone. We are back for another episode of Competitive Corner. This is the second episode in the series, and I'll be doing it on my own. We are planning another group episode as well. Really enjoyed the first one. I think the response to the first one was great. And there's a lot we need to discuss. I think that we just really got started on talking about things. Look forward to that in the future. Just a little bit of an update on the channel. So I do have some battle reports coming in. They are based on the old 3.3 system, but we didn't use any of the new rules anyway, so I think they'll play. I am working on trying to make some more basically some more panache in my videos where I want to sort of focus less on like the play by play of individuals and sort of talk more broader strategy and sort of show that in a little more animated fashion. So I am learning some of this new video editing software, and but I am going to get some battles out in the future. But in the meantime, I did want to have a discussion that's been on my mind a lot, which is just the part one, which is army wide special rules. So in this particular one, we're going to be talking about building a competitive custom army. And the first part of that is going to be talking about army wide special rules. So before we get into it, hey, I'm at 600 subscribers now. It's really great. It's really helping me to actually get some support from YouTube. I would really appreciate like, subscribe, comment. Like always, I want to sort of present this material not as me being the voice of the factual voice for everything, but more I want to get the conversation started. I want these series and really everything I do on my channel, I want it to be seen in the light of a conversation starter. So please like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know. I'm always interested in here, and hopefully this material that I'm doing can help you. So let's get into why do we need competitive armies? So we covered a little bit on the first episode of Competitive Corner. I'll just run through some of these real fast. So one, we do have some unbalanced official armies. I think that from a competitive play, and I'm speaking to be clear, I'm not talking about maybe a fun game or a narrative game of OPR. I don't want to say that those armies are kind of so unbalanced you can't enjoy it. But when we are talking about a competitive sense, bringing that balance really more being fine tuned in the competitive meta, there are some imbalances in the armies. The other thing is that we don't, from everything we have heard from OPR, that they're not really interested in sort of supporting the competitive side of the game. They don't really seem to be interested in doing that, and that's fine. I'm not here to. To me, it's perfectly fine that OPR doesn't want to support the competitive version of their game. That's where we come in. We have the custom army builder. They've given us the tools to. So the way I view it is that the people who do want it to be competitive, they can go and build their own armies and set their own rule sets. And that way we're not sort of interfering with the greater OPR community. A lot of people in OPR don't want to play competitive. Completely understand it. And so, if you're one of those people, if you want to continue watching, that's great. But I do want to, again, let's just specify, we are talking about what would a competitive meta be. And so the other thing that my particular goal is I am interested in encouraging 40K players to adopt OPR. For me, when I design custom armies, I am thinking about that. The last few custom armies I've designed, I've specifically looked at the 40K 10th edition index cards or codexes, and I've said, okay, what are these units they have? How do they act? What are some of their special abilities? And I want to sort of more closely match those to OPR. That's also just in how the units are structured and how they sort of feel stat-wise. The other thing I'm interested in doing is that by providing custom competitive armies, we really can get a lot better of constant and transparent feedback. I think that the OPR team, myself, I don't want the OPR team, whoever's involved in that, to really be trying to balance armies. I think that's way too much work for them. I think that I would prefer if OPR sort of focuses on the core rules, focuses on getting those right, focuses on sort of continuing to refine those interactions for whatever they are. I think that's really, I would prefer them to stay in instead of saying, oh, fix XYZ army. I think that's really where the competitive scene comes in, brings in the custom armies, and sort of handles that on our own. So those are some things about why I think it's important to have custom armies. So let's go into assumptions. I've covered these before. I'll just run through them real fast. When I am building these armies and I'm thinking about these criteria, I am giving some assumptions. One, I'm always thinking about competing against other kind of competitive armies, sort of. So I always like to compare it to like the official armies, sort of the A tier armies. I'm thinking about those sort of armies: Blessed Sisters, Orcs, Soul Snatcher cults, Machine Cult. Yeah, those are the armies that I like to sort of reach a certain power level. I'm also thinking about a 5 or 6 game GT, and that is a big difference, right? That I think some people who play OPR and haven't played in a tournament, like a 5 or 6 game GT tournament, there's a lot that goes into that in list building and building an army that if you're just sort of playing one off with your friends here, I'm always thinking about 3,000 points. I think that the meta, I am sort of, predicting and auguring the future that eventually we're going to see the meta for competitive play get to that 2,500, 3,000 point level. I've already discussed in detail about why I think something like 3,000 points is very good. It doesn't sort of disadvantage certain armies who have some key figures that just barely make it out of the 35% threshold percent for the army. And then no allies, right? We really have to, if we're going to be serious about any sort of competitive play, we can't bring in allies. It's just way too much balance issues and way too many just shenanigans that would happen. All right, so the criteria, just run through. I've ran through this criteria a lot. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. They have to be flexible, a lot of raw efficiency. So, no pistol hybrid taxes, a good spell list, impactful elites, cheap chaff are both very important. Multiple meaningful upgrades. I think even with the nerf to advanced tactics doubling in points, it's still a extremely good upgrade. And Caster 3 are two particular upgrades I always look for. I always, basically in my armies, I'm basically making Caster 3 to be standard. Access to Scout and Ambush. Access to lots of AP4, especially in Grimdark Future, the way the system is set up. And I'll get into talking about some of the design principles to move away from in Grimdark Future. But AP4 is very strong. And of course, just being undead. Being undead is just always a slight advantage. So the first thing I want to talk about is army-wide special rules. There's a lot I want to cover in custom armies regarding design philosophies or how to build it. But the first thing that I think that we have to talk about for me is army-wide special rules. One, of course, they can be a way to provide some flavor to an army. I think that's fine, but I don't like the idea of sort of leaning on army-wide special rules as sort of a crutch to make your army, quote, unique. My preference is actually to build differentiation through units and weapons and upgrades. I think that's how you can. To me, I think the special rules, the official special rules, the custom army builder. There is so much opportunity to build all these unique armies and to make them each play uniquely different, to have their own strengths and weaknesses. And I think that can all be done through, like I said, units and weapons and upgrades. I think some of these army-wide special rules are fine. I think that Furious, Devout, Undead, Self-Repair, Fearless, and Slow and Fast, these are, all these rules work great as army-wide special rules because they generally don't fundamentally affect one army or another. Whether they have Furious, like whether it's Devout, no matter what army you're playing against, Devout sort of works the same. It's going to affect every army the same. Same thing with everything here, right? None of these special rules sort of particularly target and sort of what I call punish one way of playing or another. Let's talk about some of the rules, though. I want to spend some time here talking about some of the problematic special rules that we see in Grimdark Future. Let's talk about the problematic army-wide rules. And I'm talking about these because people have been reaching out to me and asking me about redesigning certain armies and doing this. And I would love to do it. I have a life and I have to sort of fit this in. And I got a lot going on, and there are some other things going on as well that we'll be talking about in the future. I am continuing to work on custom armies. I think the next advanced tactics I'm working on is high elf fleets. It's a personal preference of mine, and so but to do that, you really do have to take time with these armies and develop them in detail. And when I'm developing these armies, some of the armies that when I get to them, I would just if it's me, I'm going to be admitting that I'll be removing some of these problematic army wide rules. And here's some reasons that I want to do that. For one, generally some of these problematic army wide rules, they create sort of this rock paper scissors dynamic, where it's basically entire armies are just quote bad matchups against other ones. Some of these special rules, when they're some special rules that we'll get into, they are good on individual units, but when you sort of combine them in mass across the entire army, they sort of take on a new power of their own. They can easily create an unfair and a jarring game experience. The other thing is, like I said, it's just getting into the rock paper scissors. Some of these rules, the way they're built on an army wide basis, just sort of directly counter entire other army strategies. And what that really does is, in a tournament meta, and we start talking about this, right? Tournament metas. When we're talking about creating metas, where basically some armies, because they know other armies have these army-wide special rules, just can't come to tournaments. It sort of creates this sort of tournament meta that's very stale. It really encourages people to build sort of lopsided armies and to kind of hope you don't face a bad matchup. Rather than, one thing a lot of these problematic army-wide rules do is, because of the very jarring nature, instead of building all-comer lists, people just build lopsided lists and sort of hope they don't get a bad matchup. It's sort of this dice roll mechanic, or this luck mechanic in tournaments, that just isn't fun. It creates unfun experiences. I'll talk about this for myself, and just some of these army-wide rules, they just I always say it, more than being unbalanced, there is something more important than balance. It is fun. And if some of these army-wide rules, the way they're developed, they create unfun experiences. They also, the big thing as well, is they decrease tactical depth and decision makings. When you are building an army, and not every one of your models can have a custom rule that benefits you, now it becomes a lot more about army building. It becomes all about, okay, what am I choosing? What units can I bring in? What can't? When you deploy these units, you have to start really thinking about, okay, can I put this unit here? But when everyone has the same rule, you sort of remove that decision making from the process. I always say you can always tell when a rule is problematic when a person deploys the same way for every battle. And I've seen this in a competitive meta myself through different games. When someone has the same deployment style in every battle, it's probably telling you that their army and the way the rules of that game are set up, not very fun. And it's not a very good game, because they should be being forced to set up differently across multiple games and scenarios. Let's get into some of these problematic rules. I'll go into these each in person. Daemon, I think, is the big dog being a problem. Counterattack, stealth, dodge, strider, Aegis, rending, and poison are some of the ones that I picked that I'll be talking on today. So let's just get into it as well. Daemon is the biggest one, right? Daemon is the big dog. Man, this is a very problematic rule. It's on several armies and wormhole daemons. And in Grimdark Future, I think even in beyond Grimdark Future, this one rule breaks Age of Fantasy regiments. Like, we can't consider Age of Fantasy regiments to be a serious game with this rule in it. It's just this one rule that is spread en masse across these Daemon armies just breaks it. It provides really little counterplay. I mean, when you're setting up, and I've in my practice have played some of these armies, there's really little you can do. There's little that the opponent can do because they have so little control in just the deployment phase. It discourages really any thought in deployment when you're basically, I would say, almost sort of screwed from the start. There's not much you can do. It hard counters shooting armies. Like, I think that that's just a problem, and it's really hard countered by close combat armies because because of the point system and the nature of the point system in one-page rules, which is good. When armies are bringing these universal special rules like Daemon, every one of their units is paying for it. And for a lot of close combat ranged units, they can generally aren't paying for that rule. Effectively, Daemons are just paying to be closer to their opponents for close combat armies. It's very also just discourages any sort of tactical depth in the game. It because Daemons are just going to appear where they want to and scout ahead. It just really turns into sort of dice offs where the close combat armies just immediately start clashing on turn one, and there's no maneuverability. So Daemons are just, I think that if any sort of the wormhole Daemons that I'd be looking at, they'd all lose Daemon. That rule needs to be put on certain units. It's fine, but that would not be an army-wide rule for me. Next one is counterattack. That's on Wolf Brothers. Wolf Brothers counterattacks is particularly problematic. Again, little counterplay, hard counters, close combat armies, and because if you play a shooting army, you're paying for counterattack on every unit. You're, of course, going to be pretty much hard countered by shooting armies as well. Yeah, it's a very problematic rule, especially in Grimdark Future. Because of the nature... So, this brings us a little bit into counter as well. So there's counterattack and counter. Counter as a special rule works a lot better in Age of Fantasy when most of the troops only have one attack. And that's a big deal. That when counter is happening in Age of Fantasy, first of all, there's a lot more impact, so there's already that dynamic which works. But secondly, the counter is oftentimes not on elite units, and even if it is on more elite units, those units really just have one attack and at most AP1. So counter in Age of Fantasy is actually a lot more well designed. Counterattack and counter in Grimdark Future, where the design system is based off 2 attacks for close combat, is a lot different. Those rules are a lot more powerful the moment that every other unit can get a second attack. And with Wolf Brothers, you get power fists. You can bring, energy fists and energy swords. The rule starts to break down like that, where in Age of Fantasy, you do have the rule and it's spread out, but it's sort of self-contained in the nature. I think that other units you see, like Dwarf Guilds that have counter, it's on some one-attack units, which is very well done, right? In other words, I'm not saying don't ever have counter in some of the units. I think that generally should be kept to one attack, and again, only on certain units. So counterattack is just again, we go back to it, it's a very unfun experience. No one likes to basically play fundamentally different with this rule. Yeah, stealth is another problem. I know that stealth is a problem because I've played a lot with it with Kings of War. I remember when Night Stalkers came out for Kings of War, and actually the update they did where they gave everything stealth. And really giving stealth to an entire army fundamentally changed the entire meta of all tournaments, because all of a sudden, all these shooting armies or anyone who brings shooting didn't want to anymore. Again, it provides very little counterplay. Stealth on certain units is good, where you can, but then your opponent has that choice. He can, choose to shoot the close unit at a minus or shoot a unit further away. There's sort of that tactical depth. Yeah, it hard counters shooting armies, and itself is hard countered by close combat armies, because a close combat army isn't going to shoot you, and then those armies that have stealth are basically paying wasted points. So it's a very wonky rule as well that is really shouldn't be an army rule. Same thing with dodge. You'll get the idea, right? Little counterplay. Hard counters, close combat. Dodge isn't as much of a problem because it's only really on Harlequins, Elven Gestures, but hopefully, I would say this in the future, dodge shouldn't be an army-wide rule for any sort of competitive custom army as well. Strider is as well a problem where one thing that Strider is one of those rules it's sort of absolutely necessary to have some Strider in every army. You have to have that in some. It doesn't mean that all the same units have to have Strider, but you have to have a way to navigate difficult terrain, at least some way, in every army. But the opposite is true, that Strider is really bad when you have it on the entire army, because one, the amount of difficult terrain isn't going to sort of be enough that the entire army needs Strider. You really should just be bringing Strider a certain amount. Certain armies can have more of it, and that's fine. But too much of it basically sort of is wasted points. The other thing that Strider his, especially for a tournament meta, is that it's very, just from a practical purpose. Strider, and we saw this in Kings of War. Strider is, in a tournament, it's very difficult to sort of get enough terrain in a consistent manner across all the tables. In an ideal situation, you would have plenty of terrain, and that terrain would be, very evenly matched in different ways. But a lot of tournaments, some tables just get very sparse on terrain. Some tables may not end up with enough difficult terrain. And then those Strider armies are sort of really discouraged from playing in tournaments. And again, I am talking about competitive meta from a tournament perspective, not from a fun game, right? I mean, most fun games you can get plenty of terrain, but we're talking about it specifically for tournaments where Strider-based armies are generally discouraged in tournaments because they are, guaranteed to get one or two games with really bad terrain. And that's the thing with Strider. Strider is super powerful if they have a lot of difficult terrain, and really bad if they don't. It's one of those rules that it's great to have Strider on certain units, but I don't think it should be an army-wide rule. Aegis, yeah, I mean, this is a minor one, but as a person that's played a Knights player, I'll tell you that I think that in the tournament meta, we shouldn't really discourage caster-based armies. I think certain people could bring and do some interesting things with casters, and you don't want to sort of have armies that are just going to hard counter that strategy. I think that especially for Knight Brothers, just make it, a version of Self-Repair or Putrid, right? And I don't think we need to sort of, I think it's okay to have things like Aegis or Resistance on certain characters like mages or certain monsters, but it shouldn't be army-wide. Rending. So I play at High Elf fleets as well, and this is Rending is a particular problem for High Elf fleets. One, Rending is just it's sort of I've the first custom army I ever created was High Elf fleets, and one of the main reasons I created it was because Rending is just a very problematic it's a very problematic rule in general. I would love for Rending to get reworked in the future because, one, it's cheap enough that you can bring it en masse to kill lightly armored targets, but you can also just shoot it en masse on heavily armored targets and just roll sixes. It's an ability that, again, when you have it in mass like High Elf fleets, it sort of just encourages you to spam it out, right? A lot of the good options in High Elf fleets are sort of not worth taking because you really can just spam out these Rending weapons. Of course, the other problem with Rending, and it's gotten worse with 3rd edition, is that it's even gotten worse with 3.2, where it hard counters regen more. Before 3.0, there was really much a soft counter for regen. It was only on a 6 that they ignore regen. And really from 3.0 to 3.1, 3.2, Rending has only become more and more of a hard counter for regen, and that's a particular problem because I know I've played a lot of people, and some of them bring a lot more heavier regens. One of my opponents one time said, he's like, I pay 200, 300 points in regeneration, and I just feel it was wasted. And it's true, right? I mean, and this is something that I would say about Rending, and going back to it. One of the things about en masse Rending is, whether it's balanced or not, it's unfun. No one likes to go up against an army and play that army and just be frustrated that they've wasted 200 to 300 points because they went up against the High Elf fleets player who just, spam. And that's really what you want to do with High Elf fleets, is spam out Rending. Yeah, I mean, it also, if someone doesn't have regeneration, there is a weight that's provided on Rending to counter it, and yeah, you're just wasting those points if you don't. even if Rending is kept the same, which I would love for them to rework Rending. I think that the past updates for OPR, they've constantly tweaked Rending, and I think it's showed it to be a problematic rule. I've suggested in the past that they should just completely take away any sort of countering for regen off Rending and poison and magma, and just, you know, regeneration is what it is. And that, Rending maybe could become less points. I'd love for Rending to actually just be a +2 rather than just a static AP4 on a 6. I'd love it to just sort of add an AP. Anyway, so that's the thing about Rending. It is one of those rules that, especially Rending, we'll get into Poison, but Rending is especially a very problematic army-wide rule. Same thing with Poison. Poison is another thing, is that it really can just, en masse with Dark Elf Raiders, can really just hard counter lightly armored armies. I mean, it's just effectively auto wounds. That's just not fun. It also just hard counters Rengen, and it's a little bit wasted on the regeneration side as well. And yeah, just in both of these cases, one of the things that I would heavily discourage is having rules like Aegis and Rending and the whole Rending, Poison, Magma, Regeneration dynamic, where you're sort of canceling out abilities for an opponent. It's just, I don't think it's necessary, and it just doesn't feel good. It's not fun. All right, so those are some of the problematic rules that I've covered. I've got a lot more to discuss regarding building custom armies, but this is sort of the first little mini episode. Trying to break up this and be a little shorter on their episodes here. So hey, thanks for watching. Love to get feedback, like, subscribe, and comment. Hey, if you're in Austin, join the Austin Alternative Gaming Freaks. Thank you so much.